Hello and welcome to the Atlanta Opera podcast, The Business of Opera. They say that there is no business like show business. But at the end of the day, though, it is still a business. And the question that we are interested in exploring here relates to the intersection of classical music and business. The sometimes impossible logic of non for profit, like opera companies and symphonies, and questions like how does it actually work from a business standpoint? Are there ways to grow the business and make it more sustainable? How do we bring new audiences? What is the role of leadership as we continue to forge a path forward? The series is inspired by the programming of the piece The Revolution of Steve Jobs at the Atlanta Opera in the spring of 2022. It is a brilliant and powerful opera that was written by Mark Campbell and Mason Bates and premiered at the Santa Fe Opera in 2017 and then went on to win the Grammy Award. It tells the story of an iconic leader that stood right at the intersection of business and art, technology and design, and that is, of course, the character of Steve Jobs. In preparation for the premiere of the show in Austin, Kansas City, and in Atlanta, we will have a series of interviews with business leaders, opera impresarios, artists, and strategic thinkers, as well as creative minds who will focus on two themes. Number one, the business of opera and the role of leadership in this business. And number two, the very controversial and mysterious character of Steve Jobs and the opera written about him. Hello, and welcome to our podcast, The Business of Opera. In this episode, I am hosting my friend Andy Binns. Andy is the co founder of Change Logic, and with over 25 years of consulting experience, he acts as a facilitator, provocateur, and strategic advisor to senior leaders as they set up and operate teams to explore new business opportunity. Change Logic has been a real partner to the Atlanta Opera, providing us with much needed strategic guidance during the darkest time of the pandemic. The opera had to move fast to change our business structure and think outside the box, and Andy and his team gave us their undivided attention so that we were able to pivot successfully and produce over 40 performances under the big tent. Andy is also releasing his new book in February, and it is named Corporate Explorer. And in this episode, we are talking about innovation, opera, and disruption. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Andy, your new book, Corporate Explorer, is coming out on January 2022, or actually February 2022. And I read it this weekend and I couldn't put it down as I texted to you. The premise is quite simple for this book. It's a story of innovators who are doing what other people are saying is impossible, and that's lead disruptive innovations from within a large corporations. Can you tell us a little bit about this concept?
Sure thing. And thanks for inviting me to join your podcast, Tomer. I'm really delighted to be here. I see it as just one step on my short journey to the stage, and
We'll
that
talk about
casting of
that as well.
Leporello, which
We'll
I'm
talk
looking
about
for.
that journey
Yeah,
as
yeah,
well.
good. I'm not letting you off then. So yes, so Corporate Explorer is exactly what you say. It's sort of a real story of managers who do what conventional wisdom says isn't possible, which is to do disruptive, radical innovation inside large corporates. And we look at innovation as being something that's a job of startups, your Ubers and the Netflix and Facebooks and whatever who have come to dominate the economy, led by founders. But what you find is that there are fabulous examples of managers who do innovate and create new businesses. And in the book, we tell those stories and how they do it. The practices they adopt and how they make it happen. And these are people like Christian Kurtish in Hungary, creating this insurance business. Just this morning in Fast Company, they have an article about my friend Yoki Matsuoka at Panasonic creating a whole new business there. And there's so many examples of this going on, and they can lead to being multi-billion-dollar organizations, and we tell those stories of the successes in the book.
Well, what I find super interesting is that we are basically struggling with the same question. You know, an opera company main focus is putting on live shows, and here we are producing a podcast or a film or YouTube video, which is not our main product. It's not
Yeah.
our core competency. And so, how do you develop that within an organization that is focused on one task and that's what they know how to
Yes.
do?
and
So,
and I think that that's the right way to think about it, is to see these two things as different. And I think that's one of the secrets to what you're doing in Atlanta, is you're recognizing that although your core, product, if you will, is the live musical experience, how you then use that can be multiple different things. And you've got to recognize that it's not just a matter of taking opera and sending it out digitally. It's about a whole nother experience, and therefore a separate business or business model, if you will. And that
however,
separation of the two is really key. Go ahead.
it's a key. However, product integration is also a key because
Yes.
if the New York Times, the newspaper, had to write a new newspaper in order to have their
Yes.
iPod or I mean iPad version, then we
Yes.
would they wouldn't be able to do that. So product integration and economy of scale and being able to leverage one
Yes.
product to be
That's
transposed
right.
into another is a key.
And that's why the book is called, or subtitled, How Corporates Beat Startups at the Innovation Game, right? Because they leverage the assets they've already got. If you have to go and record Carmen for live audiences, then you're going to go do another Carmen. You've just doubled the expense and the workload involved in it. You've got assets you can reuse. And if you can be smart enough at how to separate them, but as you say, then be mindful of the points of integration, then you can get a lot more value. And you can go faster than startups as a result of that.
Well, and this is why I'm so excited about this conversation because it's so topical for opera companies who are struggling right now with the possibilities, the incredible possibilities, but also with the challenges of
Yes.
digital, and not only digital during a pandemic, but also digital post pandemic when the analog world live productions will be back, and then the question will
Mhm.
become: are we going to be able to continue to perform live and at the same time have a digital platform with all of our additional productions there? So, but since we're talking about opera, I want to take a step back and talk to you a little bit about opera. You love
Great.
opera.
I
And
do.
tell us a
I
little
do.
bit about your history with opera, Andy.
Well, my history as opera is I've learned quite common, is that as a child I got listening to Mario Lanza, and it became somehow a sound that just touched me in a way that just nothing else did. And although I love lots of other music and other musical styles, um, um, vocal music, classical vocal music, be it opera or classical song, art song, really just connects with me in a different way. And I don't have a musical background, but I was actually on a training course for a management consulting firm I was with when I was in my 20s. And the woman leading this was a lady called Mary Beth Bunch, who happened to be the writer of a book called The Anatomy of the Human Singing Voice. And most students, many of my subsequent singing teachers, knew Mary Beth. And so I was sort of blessed with this extraordinary moment where I say, well, over a bar, as a drink in the bar, I was like, Mary Beth, this presenting stuff you're teaching us is interesting, but it's the opera thing I'm really interested in. And I told her my love of singing and of music. And she said, sure, we can tune you up, Andy. And so over a period of time, I committed to working with her and then other teachers, and I was able to do some performances. My first performance was on my 40th birthday, when I corralled my friends and made them listen to me. But I've done some semi-professional work since, and enjoyed it enormously. It makes a huge difference to explore a different aspect of words and my personality, and also being in front of an audience. So
That's
it's been
fun.
it's
I remember that in one of our workshops that you conducted with the opera staff, you started singing the catalog aria from Don Giovanni.
I think I could do the Don as well. I do a nice Devienia alla Finestra as well,
Oh,
if you know. So
oh.
there's always possibilities.
As long as you don't start with the soprano arias, I'm willing to listen. Now, Andy, let's talk a little bit about opera corporations and innovations.
Yes,
The Atlanta Opera is not a major corporation. We don't think of ourselves as a
right.
major corporation. We think
No,
of ourselves as a nimble regional opera company. Do you think real innovation, or as you call
yeah,
it in your book, corporate exploration, is
yeah,
possible within the
yes,
largest opera corporations in the world?
right,
In other words, at the Metropolitan Opera, Vienna Staatsoper,
yeah,
Covent Garden, the big opera
yeah,
behemoth,
yeah.
is innovation really possible? How
Well,
and why is it so difficult?
maybe how and why, but there's also the do they have an option? And I'd love your view on this as well. So it seems to me there is no option. I mean, not, COVID has clearly put opera in a crisis around the world for obvious reasons, but it's already it's unsustainable in the long term. That fabulous article several years ago in Opera magazine about how 68% of the funding in global opera comes from some part of the German state. 68%. That means that every singer you engage has, and many of them have training in some regional or city opera company in Germany. It's not going to last. Germany's in a moment economically right now that may not last. And we could go into why I think that might be the case. But so there's a problem. There's then the digital problem that you already referenced. The attention of audiences, the expectations of consumers. I think we need to move now in order to sustain what is such an important and beautiful part of our world. So why? So before we move on, what do you think of that? Is that a reasonable analysis that I make?
I think that opera is going to survive no matter what. It's an art form
Sure.
that's been around for over 4 centuries, and there's always been predictions about the demise of opera. And somehow, opera is always finding a way to move forward.
Hmm.
One of my favorite books is called The Rational Optimist, and it
Hmm.
talks about how we tend to look at life in a very pessimistic way. The sky's always falling, and it's always the end
Hmm.
of something. But as a matter of fact, there's a lot to be optimistic about, and I am optimistic about the future of opera. I think there is no replacement for live performance and for the power of the unamplified human voice. And I
Yes.
think the questions, though, is how do you find ways to connect to audiences
Yes.
that are highly sophisticated, that are highly used to visual stimulations and storytelling that are on the highest level, and
Yes.
being able to do that with this medium, for me, is the future. And how does digital play into that is a part of the question.
Yeah, totally. And I think what you're describing is really a story of renewal, right? And
Right.
and how do you both take what is so such an extraordinary thing about this unamplified human voice and just the sheer beauty, but also sort of somehow emotional connection that it brings, and the stories that it permits, but then update it. And you know some of the reasons why it's difficult are the same for any organization. It's the learned routines and unchallenged assumptions of how things are done around here. That and we can look at different industries and see exactly the same. You know, any profession, be it electrical engineers, actuaries in insurance companies, advertising industry executives, they have a set of assumptions about how things are done. And those get put into our organizational structures, into what we measure, what we think is important, but also our behaviors. How we treat one another, how we think about our work. And so, if opera is going to renew itself, it's got to be willing to look at some of those things, and think about how it might be able to maybe organize itself differently, and adapt to this different world, and that could be very challenging. I think there are some people who've done it. I think you have obviously been doing this, but the larger firms, the larger companies, I had the benefit of spending time with Christopher Widauer, who was previously at the Vienna Staatsoper, and Christopher did a fantastic job of introducing the live broadcasting and streaming capabilities within the opera, bringing some of the most advanced streaming capabilities um, in all of Austria into the opera. He was the first buyer for some of this equipment, which he had down in the basement at the opera house, and with remote control cameras. And instead of the sort of 40 or 50 people that the state broadcaster wanted to put in the opera house to do broadcasts, he had three. And I met the woman who sat up there and did the remote control cameras, right? So the reality is you can change, and people have changed, but that was just one little step that he made, and what we're talking about is something a bit bigger, I think.
Well, and it all comes full circle for us when we are presenting this year an opera about the ultimate innovator, disruptor, Steve Jobs.
Yeah,
And
totally.
here's a man who led extreme corporate exploration within Apple, so much that he basically revolutionized seven different fields, from personal computers to phones and tablet computers to animated movies, the music industry, digital publishing, and even retail stores. And when you think about leaders like Steve Jobs, and we'll talk a little bit about the opera in a second, but when you think about him and what he's done in a behemoth company like Apple, what makes somebody be able to do that?
Yeah, yeah. So Steve Jobs is almost like the Wagner of the business world, right? It's sort of, and there's
I
a sort
like
of
that analogy.
a consuming narcissism that goes with it, right? As well,
Right,
a real
right.
personality difference. You'd never recommend anybody copy Wagner's personality. And similarly, we wouldn't want to encourage people to go off and copy Steve Jobs' personality necessarily.
Well,
But
well,
some of
well,
their
that
philosophy,
is a part of the discussion in this podcast, because
yeah,
some people think he is an incarnation of some god, and
right,
others completely vilify him. And your friend Charles O'Reilly, who
yes,
wrote an essay about narcissistic syndrome in Steve
that's right,
Jobs, uh, Elizabeth Holmes, and Donald Trump is another way of looking at it.
yes,
Where
yes.
are you?
Well, I didn't know Steve Jobs, so I can't judge, and I'm not a psychologist. So I can't judge whether he was a narcissist or not. What I can do is admire the leadership philosophy he brought, which for me is really distinctive. The first part of that is his focus on sort of what does the customer really need. You listed quite rightly all of the different industries he disrupted, none of which he set out to disrupt. Right? That wasn't the point. The point was, what did you and I need from this device? What do we do in our lives that he enabled? Right? What's the outcome I need? The outcome I need is, today I'm pulling up an app for calorie counting, see if I can lose a few pounds. Right now, that's he didn't sit there thinking, "Oh, I'm going to do that for Andy Binns." He thought, "I want to be able to create something that is an experience that people can shape themselves, and I'm going to really worry about how people use devices, what they want to get done in their life, and how things happen." So that sort of focus not on the product, the technology, or any of those sorts of things, but instead on the what does your user, your customer really want to do? That's a fundamental. But also the relentless focus he brought to executing it.
Mhm.
So he didn't say, "Well, we know we want to do that." But well, Joe and Lucy and Fred over here, they have interest in doing some other things. So we'll just compromise it slightly and make it work for everyone. To be rude, he called bullshit on that. He just said, "No, I'm not going to accept that. We're going to be really focused on delivering an experience that is consistent with our intentions." And that's pretty special and differentiated, and it's something that I think we all can learn from and take from, is that degree of focus, even if we don't want to do it in a narcissistic way.
So in your book, you actually talk about those three phases of ideation, incubation, and going to scale. And
That's right.
so you're basically saying, ideas are cheap. There's a lot of ideas. The incubation part is really important and should be nurtured,
Yeah,
and then also
yeah,
figuring out how to go to scale with those ideas
yes,
is a key.
that's right. That's right. And the ideation issue, like how do we generate ideas, is gets a huge amount of attention in the world of innovation, and it's fun, right? It's exciting, and you sort of spin with all the possibilities and opportunities that exist out there. But really, what matters is, can you experiment and find out which ones work, which ones people value, right? And I think Jobs is doing some of that as well. He was, because he was so focused on the insight about what people need. He was then going to play with different ways of meeting that need and adapt to what worked, right?
Exactly.
And so that's again, there was an interesting article today in the Guardian, exactly on this point, that they did. Some researchers applied AI to the creative output of movie directors and also painters, and I think another constituency. We probably do it with opera composers perhaps as well. And what they said was that the string of most successful creative output is preceded by a period of experimentation. Lots of movies, different themes, different things, not necessarily successful, but they're finding their way before they land on a formula that works. And in essence, that's what we're talking about: is how do you, get a set of ideas, but what really matters is how do you experiment with them? Lots of little things, and then land on the thing that's going to work, and then relentlessly focus on making it happen. Rather than what tends to happen, there's a couple of pathologies. One of them is lots of ideas. Let's have lots and lots of ideas because ideas are basically good. But do any of them? Oh no, that's a little too much for us. That means committing, right? The other thing we do is get an idea at the beginning and just drive it through without any relationship to whether it's needed, right? That sort of single-mindedness is what people think Jobs did, and I don't think it is. Jobs had a philosophy, but he was always learning about what customers valued. He wasn't an iPhone enthusiast. What he was a customer enthusiast, right? And that's a completely different thing, And I don't know how it translates into opera. Candidly, I think it's a very challenging. And you and I have talked a lot about this in the work that you've been doing. It's like how you do not have customers in the sense that you have to give me exactly what I want as an opera consumer. That would kind of be a very banal way. You'd end up with all these David McVicker productions of Tosca that I know you love so much, right? So how do you think about that customer in, outside in lesson that Steve Jobs
It's
gave
interesting
us?
because as you talked about it, I recalled the Walter Isaacson book, which I is like the Bible for anybody that
Mm,
really want to study
mm,
Steve Jobs, and
yeah,
as we prepare for the opera.
yeah,
And one famous thing that Steve Jobs said is that the customer doesn't know what they want. We will bring them something they never thought about, and the same thing Wagner said. They don't
hmm
know. we
hmm
we will bring it to them. I think you're right
hmm
in that he never stopped asking himself as he was developing the products, how they feel about it and what's going to make it the most amazing. And
yeah,
when he heard questionable feedback, he addressed it.
yeah,
But another part of his character, and the most revealing and insightful moment for me in the Walter Isaacson biography, is this idea of RDF, reality distortion field. And when Steve Jobs was in Apple, his team coined that term, and I find it incredible. It's basically capturing his essence as a leader, as a visionary leader.
yeah,
That it's a personal refusal to accept the limitations that reality
yes,
imposes on
yes,
his own ideas.
yes,
And
yes,
if it stood in his way, he just denied that it happened. And
yes,
you know, in some ways, that explains why he was able to deliver an iPhone in the pace that he was able to, or the
yes,
iPod, or the iPad, or any, or
yes,
iTunes, or you name it.
yeah,
But it also was the reason. that he denied the fact that he had a daughter. Here's a DNA that proves that Lisa is your daughter. I don't care. I have my own field of reality. Or you are sick with pancreatic cancer. I'm going to go on a fruitarian diet and I'm going to be
Yeah.
okay. That's what killed him.
Right.
So
Right.
it's a fascinating concept. And one of the things I wanted to ask you as it pertains to your research, do you feel that innovators like Wagner, who by the way had the similar thing, I'm going to
Right.
build a theater that will
Yeah.
accommodate, even
Yeah.
with the seats made of wood,
Yeah.
the magnanimity of my music. Do you feel
Yes.
that leaders have to have an RDF, a reality distortion field, in order to be successful?
I think that they do need um, extraordinary commitment to a vision. And that when I look at all of the corporate explorers that I described earlier, what connect them and entrepreneurs, because I think entrepreneurs are very related, but they're different. Steve Jobs was an entrepreneur, and he drove his business, and he left and came back, so that makes him a little bit different in some ways. But the corporate explorer is sitting inside an organization already, and I think that they do need this vision, this ability to be really focused on what they want to achieve, what they want to have happen in the world, and but it can be more participative, more open than the reality distortion field. It does not have to be that narcissistic type of outcome, right? It can be inclusive, right? So one leader that we talk about in the book is at the company NVIDIA. Jensen Huang is the CEO of NVIDIA, which is one of those companies you've never heard of, but is enormously important to the world in terms of the silicon chips that it makes that used to power the graphics and computers, but now AI and autonomous driving and all sorts of things. And Jensen started his transformation, his renewal, right, by saying, "Hey, engineers, I want to find problems that um, nobody else has solved, that only we can do in a differentiated way, right? That if we were to solve this, we would be excited, and so would everybody else." And he opened the door to his team and said, "Let's go find those problems. Right? Let's figure out how to solve them." So he is dedicated, driven, has driven astounding, return to his shareholders over the last 10 years with that vision. But it's more inclusive. It's more enabling of others. And the thing about Jobs is, it can you replicate that, really, just the single person, and does it mobilize others to action? Because really, if you want to lead an organization, it's not about what you can do, it's what you can cause others to do. And that's in a sense why I say that his philosophy is so much that matters, right? But the world has learned something about the relentless focus on the end user and customer that they take from Jobs and reuse in so many ways without him. So he had that impact. Can everybody have that impact without that kind of clarity? Yeah, they can. Do they need to be narcissists and they do it? I don't think
I
so.
agree with you. That said, it's really interesting when you look at his character from an operatic standpoint, right?
Mm,
Because we're talking about the opera about Steve
yeah.
Jobs. There's a dichotomy that there's a dichotomy about him that creates this enigmatic, mysterious character that is
Mm,
very much operatic. Because if you think about the
mm,
classic characters from
mm,
Pinkerton in Madame Butterfly
sure.
to Wotan in The Ring and even Don
Yeah.
Jose in Carmen, those are
Yes.
characters that are not necessarily black or white.
Yes.
There's a dangerous combination of charisma and danger. Uh,
Yes.
and Steve Jobs is.
Yeah. I was thinking more Simon Boccanegra. It has that sort of titan that is conflicted, and but has something about him as a leader.
Yeah, and the Flying
That
Dutchman. I
is
mean, it's this
absolutely,
kind of.
yes. That does seem better. Yeah.
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 So
And I hope it's a baritone role. I hope you haven't
it is a
got it.
baritone role.
Yeah, that's good. That's
All
good.
the great roles baritone,
Well, it
right?
has to be bad.
The
It's
tenors are
terrific.
just good guys,
Uh,
and they're usually paid much more. So
yeah, I know, I know, I
yeah,
know.
but Apple famously said in was it 1997, I think, the idea of think differently. Um,
Yes.
uh, do you think that could apply to the arts and to opera? Think differently,
Um, yeah, I think that it should. I think it's back to this question of renewal. Um, I would love to see us maybe think about how could we reinvent the opera experience, right? And think completely differently from first principles. What if you had, a commitment to that experience of storytelling using the unamplified human voice? But once you've got that, well, okay, let's now rethink it. That's a cornerstone of the operatic experience. What else might you do to design an experience that would allow that may be completely different from sitting in a big glorious opera house with the red velvet seats and the fine chandeliers. Because I don't think those things are opera. They just happen to be the current vessel, right, in
right?
which we put opera. But there's no reason why you can't find a different and more engaging or engaging, differently engaging. There's something unengaging for me about sitting with the chandeliers, but a different way of engaging a broader audience, different audience, maybe igniting a different emotional response as a result.
Well, I think it's all about the experience right now,
Mm.
and I think the days of proscenium theater may be numbered. Watching a show in a box
Yes,
is has been a tradition for 400 years,
yes,
but some of the most successful things we see is immersive theater,
yes,
immersive opera,
yes,
from Park Avenue Armory to our own Discovery series at the Atlanta Opera, where you perform in a botanical gardens or in a
yes,
jazz club or in a tango bar, etc.,
yes,
etc. And I think
yes.
that could be a lot of the
And,
future
and
of opera.
and it could be that the story is not about the big opera houses. The
Right.
story is much more about the strength and vibrance of the medium size opera companies and their ability to engage broader and broader audience. Because really speaking, the quality of the singers is a tiny difference between the Met and the Atlanta Opera. These are the same folks very often. Maybe not always in major roles in the large opera houses, but most people can't tell the difference either in the singing or in their dramatic or acting capabilities. And so the what we can do in a smaller format, I think, is just as exciting, and should be experienced.
Now let's talk a little more about that. You're a part of the advisory board of the Atlanta Opera, and you've been working with us for on and off for about 5 years now.
Yeah,
You're also a very busy man on many aspects. Not only the book that you're writing, but also a very active consultant with Change Logic. You could spend your time on many things, yet you give us some time for a non-for-profit like the Atlanta Opera. Why do you spend time from all the other activities that you could do on the
for sure.
Atlanta Opera?
I think the reason is that it gives me and my team, my colleagues in Change Logic, our firm, it gives us a different window on the world, a different vantage point. It's easy to stay trapped in, the boardrooms or executive suites of large companies, and that's really interesting and exciting work to do. But I think it gives us a different window. We do work with social impact organizations of different kinds as well. I'm working with a mental health charity on their strategy at the moment as well, and so it's partly give back, I guess, in terms of our contribution to the to society. But it's more than that. It's about being able to just look at situations. So just you have different constraints than a large company does. Large companies have pretty big constraints as well. They look unconstrained from the outside, but it's just not true. You have different constraints, and it's exciting and it's a great learning experience to figure out how you're going to make this kind of renewal, bringing digital experiences of opera to hopefully an ever expanding consumer base that problem is as exciting to me as how you sell more silicon chips or insurance policies.
Well, Andy, this has been a real pleasure. And I think we covered a lot in this conversation. I want to thank you for a wonderful book that I highly recommend, The Corporate Explorer, that is coming up in a few short months. And I want to thank you for everything you do for the Atlanta Opera and for opera in general.
Well, I want to thank you, Toma. Thank you for this invitation today. Thank you for highlighting and saying kind things about our forthcoming book, Corporate Explorer. But I also want to thank you for the innovation you bring to opera, because it is something that I love, as I've said, and it needs this renewal and reinvention, and it's great to see your commitment to that, and I'm excited to what the coming years will bring.
Thank you, Andy.